meet you again very soon.
Would you introduce yourself and your family briefly?
Yes, I'm Fay Duda. I am a West Australian, fifth generation Australian. I have two boys and each of those have a son. So my husband and I are grandparents, and my parents live down the road. They are 90 and 87. So a very close family community in this area. So,
Alright, yeah. So in this house you live with
I've lived in this house since 1980.
1980.
Apart from a brief stint in Kalgoorlie. My husband was in the police force.
Oh, really?
And he transferred to Kalgoorlie.
I used to be in police force.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
For 5 years.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, he did 37, I think, 30, and then
37.
he decided he'd had enough and retired.
Right, okay.
But we did 3 years in Kalgoorlie, which was
I
fantastic because that's where I grew up.
Oh, right.
So was returning.
So you came to Perth in 1980?
I came to Perth, in 1967. My parents transferred to Perth and from Kalgoorlie and brought all of my 3 siblings, my 2 brothers and a sister, and we moved to Perth. Primarily, Dad had an opportunity to go into business down here.
I see.
And he wanted us educated in Perth at the high schools. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You are the first honorary consul of,
I am. I am.
Korea in Western Australia. Right?
That's correct, and I was really surprised about that. Ambassador Kim in 2015 approached me. His tenure was almost up, and he had a bucket list, if you like, and one of those was to make sure that there was an honorary consul in Western Australia to represent the community. He approached me and asked me if I would put in my CV. And my response to him was, why me? And his response to me was, why not? I said, I don't speak Korean. And he said, we don't want you in Korea. So as a consequence, I said, why not? So I submitted my application and eventually it went through the approvals in Korea and with Australia with DFAT. And subsequently signed off by the WA Premier and Julie Bishop as Foreign Minister in 2016. So officially 6th of May 2016 is when I assumed the role.
Right. So it has been about now 4 years?
Yeah, 5 years in May. So
5 years in May, so...
It's been interesting. It's been very interesting
right.
and something that I guess I'm very grateful for that opportunity. When I asked the ambassador why me, he said, well, you've worked in politics, you've worked in business, and you've worked in community roles supporting not-for-profits. We think that that's a good mix for what we're looking for. Of course, there was no template, and it was a steep learning curve for me to find out what the needs of the community were, and that's not just the Korean community, but business community, veterans community, and it all came together very nicely.
That's right, yeah.
Yes.
That's right, yeah. Since before you were appointed, were you interested in Korean culture or did you have any basic knowledge about Korea? Or?
I did because I had my own business in 2011 to 2014 with a former business partner who went into the federal parliament, and then my brother. But we did some work for Swan Energy, who were doing solar and wind, and it's subsequently got the contract to put solar on all the West Australian government schools. But that was with James Reed, and as a consequence of that, I got to meet, my brother was the CEO of the Renewable Energy Association, and I got to meet people from Hyundai, LG, when they came out for a global conference in Perth.
So even before you were appointed honorary consul, you were already accustomed to Korean culture and you knew about Korean bit of history.
Yes, I knew. I wasn't so much immersed in the culture, but I was aware of Korea and its achievements and the history of the Korean War.
So when you were chosen, would they be sort of a required qualification to be
Not in the Honorary Consul role. You generally find that the Honorary Consuls, a lot of them have a business background in the Honorary Consuls in Western Australia. Many of them actually run businesses as well. But I think it was the mix of business understanding of government and working with community groups that appealed to the then Ambassador Kim. So.
Right. Yeah. Why do you think Ambassador Kim chose you?
I have no idea. As I said, he said why not, and in the end I said why not. Look, I got on very well with Ambassador Kim, and he when he asked, he spoke with me about putting in my CV, and I did have a conversation with him about, well, surely you want somebody who's got a much more higher profile in business, and his view was that he wanted somebody that could represent everybody and not have a vested interest in personally things that would be of personal advantage, I guess. Yeah.
Were there any other competitors at that time?
I don't know. Applications had to go through the embassy and back to Korea, so not too sure. It took probably 6 months before I heard anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Could you briefly introduce what you did before you became Honorary Consul?
So I had a role in government initially. I worked for 3 members of parliament who were ministers federally. I'd worked for 2 members of parliament that were ministers in state government, and I'd always had an interest in politics as or government, but not wanting to be in politics. So the natural progression was to work in and around the political environment. I've always had a belief that you need to take an interest in the government that represents you, and whatever your political persuasion is, you really need to have an opinion about various matters that come up from time to time.
And I think many Koreans, even Jess, she didn't know what Honorary Consul do. So
Exactly.
She asked me, and I told her that's why we have an interview. So could you introduce what you're doing as an Honorary Consul?
Well, there's quite a range of Honorary Consuls from many countries.
Yes.
And I understand that I thought perhaps that because Korea was actually Western Australia's third biggest export market, and even amongst my friends, when I mentioned that I was taking on the role, it became obvious to me that Korea is a quiet achiever. Korea doesn't put itself out there necessarily. As I became involved in the Australia-Korea Business Council and with the Korean education side of things, also representing the veterans community, I understood how much Korea meant to our economy, but it also meant a lot to the veterans who had served in Korea and were really appreciative of the, the goodwill that was still exists today between the two people. I also worked for some community groups. I did some work for not-for-profits when I had my business and when I worked for a consultancy firm. And I got to appreciate that not everybody knows where to go to get help. I've had some interesting questions from people. It's not just where do I go to get a visa, how do I travel to Korea. I have Korean community people contacting me about their renewal of their passports. None of this I can't process it. That's all done by the consular people in Canberra. But what I can do is point them in the right direction, give them some background, make sure they've got all the information they need before they contact the embassy. It makes that transition so much easier. I've had cases where people have been in car accidents and the embassy's asked me to go and check on them. Sometimes the police will contact me with lost passports, or somebody's lost a family member or somebody's in hospital that they need to connect up with the consular corps or with the consul in Canberra. I've had some students contact me. One girl was doing a school project on a Korean opera singer and didn't know how to buy the sheet music. So I contacted a friend of mine in Korea, Jenny Kang, who had been at Curtin University, and Jenny helped me purchase the music, and this young girl did it as her Year 12 project. And father sent me a recording, so just quite different things that you would never expect, but it's all linking. The Korea connection is really important. Korean education with, it doesn't have approval for ATAR, and we are trying very hard to get the School Curriculum Council of Western Australia to support Korean language. At the moment, Willetton High School and Mount Lawley High School were the only two that were doing Korean in secondary school. Next year I think it will only be Mount Lawley High School. And there seems to be a lack of appetite to give them an ATAR rating, which allows students to get points to go into university, and yet the UWA has the highest number of students wanting to study Korean culture, Korean language, through the Professor Helving Wang. And so we have been on a bit of a mission to raise the profile of Korean language with students. Unfortunately, in Western Australia, we're so remote from the East Coast. Some of the wonderful cultural events that students get to experience on the East Coast, they don't get to experience it here. So we sort of have to rely on UWA and now with the UWA Research Centre to keep that profile of Korea front of mind for students as an option.
Are you satisfied with your job as a Honorary Consul?
Yes, I do love it. I find that we just recently had the Korean Veterans Association annual dinner, but it was also a launch of the Korean War Memorial Project. And seeing the veterans that we had presented Ambassador for Peace medals to, it's just an amazing story. They are so grateful that they are acknowledged by the Korean government, but we've managed to link up families, old friends that serve together, families, grandchildren of people who have or veterans that have died, and we've managed to link that up with Mr. Junko Lee's group of the Korean Veterans Association. So whenever we present these medals, I work with an RSL in close to the areas where the veterans are. We set the whole thing up. Mr. Lee comes in, Korean community come. There's this sort of wonderful mix of Korean community and veterans community that all come together, and it's really quite rewarding. I find that has been really rewarding, and getting approval in principle from the Kings Park Botanical Gardens has been another wonderful thing that we've been able to do, and it seems to be as important for the Korean community as it is for the Australian veterans to have this memorial here.
And what is your plan in the future?
My plan in the future?
Firstly, your term must be renewed, right?
Yes, so my term has to be renewed. I did raise that when I spoke with Ambassador when he was here recently, and I gave him the option that he may not want me to reapply, but he said no, send in your CV. We need to renew your term. There are things that I still want to see achieved. I would like to see the Korean War Memorial Project to its end, which will be in July 2023. We've got a long way to go in the planning of that. I do want to continue to help Jake Jong, who's the Korean teacher at Mount Lawley High School, and the UWA Research Centre in promoting Korean language and Korean culture. I think it's really, really important. It's really important for West Australians to understand that Korea is very important to our economy, but there are a lot of things that tie us together as a community and as two countries. I recently assisted the Australia Korea Business Council with their hydrogen forum, and we had 130 people at that. We ran a forum probably 18 months ago and had similar numbers. So there is great interest in West Australian businesses doing business with Korea and in Korea. I do get a lot of contacts from businesses who are sending skilled workers up to Korea to work in shipyards and other things, and on various projects. So even from a West Australian business perspective of sending people up to Korea, they need to understand what the visa requirements are and how to ensure that their workers get them in a timely fashion because they can't be processed here.
I'm wondering, from time to time, do you get inquiries from Western Australians about Korean business or other?
I do, yeah, absolutely. Look, it's quite amazing. Even students, parents have contacted me because their daughter or the son have been going to Korea and they're wanting to know a bit of background about what the country's like, what the culture's like. Those students, two of them particularly in the last 2 years, have come back and they actually are now studying Korean with a view to going and living in Korea.
Oh, yeah.
So the same with businesses. People who come here, sometimes they're looking for a police clearance because they've now become or wanting to become Australian citizens, but they've worked in Korea, so they have to get a police clearance through the embassy, but it has to be done in person. And it's very important that we get the consular officials over here every 3 months to look after the needs. But businesses, yes, recently people from the fishing industry have been speaking with me, and they're very interested in looking at Korean markets. Just one example, hydrogen, obviously the conference recently, there's a lot of key players in that area. There's so much that we can do as sort of cross relationship.
And this may be a personal or private question. What sort of a hobby or what sort of a religion you have?
Look, I've got an interesting background. My grandparents some were Salvation Army, some were Methodist, some were Catholic.
Oh, yeah.
I went to a Catholic school, I went to a Church of England school. I've been brought up in a Christian environment, but not specifically practicing any one religion. I've got a fairly broad view because of my upbringing, realising that all religions have their place. And
you want to say anything to Korean community?
Look, I think sadly this year has been quite difficult because of the COVID virus. We haven't had the opportunity to have the Korean family night. We haven't had the opportunity to have the big festival that normally happens in end of September. And I think I had been pushing towards inviting more of my friends along to those events, particularly the one that was held at Kent Street annually. So I really look forward to next year being able to keep profiling what the Korean community does in Perth. I think it's really important. I was able to help Cliff Lim with a letter that supported the moving of the Korean Community Association to new premises. I understand that's been delayed because of COVID, but I think it will be really great that they've got a place where they can do more of the events in and around their seniors and their veterans, and even inviting community leaders to what would be, I understand, a meeting point.
Right. Okay, thank you very much for today's interview.
Sorry.
Despite you're so busy.
No, it's fine, honestly, and thank you for getting here at promptly.
Yes.
That's my eldest son. That's
Eldest son.
my daughter-in-law. That's my son. So they're married.
Okay.
This is their child Rusty,
Are
who's
they
3.
whole family or?
This is Catherine's family. This is my family. Oh, actually, that's Catherine's sister. So obviously, that's my parents on the end. And this is my little grandson, Digby. He's now 1. Digby. And, oh, sorry. And this one here is my little treasure. This is Rusty. He's grown a bit since then. He's just been to a crocodile farm, so he's quite excited to share his news today. But as you can see, so we've been to...
these are...
Yeah, that's all my travels, you see, my collection. So China, obviously, that was when I got in Korea. Venice, UK, that was Isle of what is it, Tobermory, the name of the town. That was from Germany. Well, that was from Prague. The cats were from Canada.
Prague was very good.
Prague's beautiful. Obviously Kenya, the little ones. And some more from Croatia. Yes, so...